Welcome back to another Photoshop tutorial with PSD Box. My name is Andre, and today I will show you how to make this manipulation, which I called I Want You Back. And at the time I recorded this, I didn't have the text tutorial, so I took some notes with some of the color values and some of the layers that I used. This is the layers palette, but I will do it all over again, so let's start. I'll create a new document with the canvas size that you can see here, so I'll click OK. You can use any canvas size that you want, but in this case I was limited by the size of the ground here, but anyways. And I already have some of the images cropped. The woman and the ground, I already have them cropped, so that I don't spend too much time on that, because I assume you already know how to do that, so I'm not gonna spend time on that. So there's three stock images used for this manipulation. This is the background, this is the ground that I said I already have it cropped, and also the woman. So I'll start by opening the background, and I will select all with Ctrl A, copy it and paste it here. And with Ctrl T, load the free transform, press the Shift key, click this bottom right control point and scale this image something like that. And now open the ground image, copy this one as well, paste it here and drag it down to about here. And I will rename this to city because this is my background, and I will name this layer to ground and get rid of the original background layer. So once you have the background set up like this, it's time to start making adjustments to this, and I used adjustment layers for that. And the first thing that I added is a gradient map, and I chose one with 3 colors. And I'll check my notes for the exact color values. So for the first one is 0F, and the second one is 315F0B, and the last one is D29 D1D. I'll click OK. I'll hide the ground layer for the moment and set the blend mode of this to hard light and decrease the opacity to about 35%. So that's the before and that's the after. The next adjustment layer that I used is color balance. And for the shadows, I used the values 17, 12, and -10. For the midtones, I used 2, 12, and -22. And for the highlights, 48, 8, and 17. So that's the color balance adjustment layer, so you can see it before and after. Now I can move on and start working on the ground layer, and I will add a new adjustment layer. And the first thing I will add is curves, because I want to make this darker, and of course I have to use it as a clipping mask. If you press the Alt key and put the mouse between 2 layers, you can see the cursor changing, and you can create a clipping mask. So just drop the opacity of the contrast, of the ground layer, and then use a gradient map again as a clipping mask. And I use the 2 color gradient, and for the shadows I used 2E, 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 Click OK. And for the highlights, I used the color 0F3D2E. Click OK and click OK. And the blend mode that I used for this is multiply at 50%, and that's it. And then I wanted to make the bottom part a bit darker and the top part a bit brighter, because that's where the light comes from. So I used a gradient overlay with black and white and set the angle to 113 degrees and set the blend mode to soft light, and I decreased the opacity to 90%, so that way we have this part a bit darker. Maybe the angle is to, okay, something like that, 110 degrees, okay, something like that. And then, in order to make the whole scene a bit darker, I used another gradient map, but this time no clipping mask. And this is a 3 colors gradient map, and the color values for this are 15596F. For the middle color, for the midtones, is 646B44, and for the highlights is FF9837. Okay, click OK, and the blend mode that I used for this is soft light at 100%. So that's the before and after. So it makes the whole scene a bit darker. And then I added the first light effects, and again I used one of my stock images. I used one of my optical flares stock. You can download that from my website. On the text tutorial there is a link to that. So if you're watching this from YouTube, there's a link to the article, so you can check it and you can download the stock images needed for this. And I used the optical 8 image, so copy that, put it here, switch the blend mode to screen, and I used it at 100%, so the original size. And I'll turn this into a smart object because I want to add some blur to it and see how it looks. Yeah, I add about 10 pixels of blur and place it somewhere here. And I also want to change the hue, so I'll use an adjustment layer. So I'll set the hue to -10 or something like that. And if you think the effect is too strong, you can reduce the opacity a bit, but it's not looking too nice if you do that, so I prefer to have it at 100%. So once you have this, you can move on and add the woman. And as I said, I already have it extracted from the background. I used the pen tool. So here on the hair, you can see that I didn't do any special masking for it. So select all, edit, copy. So I will paste it here, and I'll make it a bit smaller, something like that. Okay, now I have to make some adjustments to the layer, which I will name woman, because you have to blend her with the environment. And again, I used adjustment layers, and the first thing I used is color balance as a clipping mask layer, and the values that I have for the shadows are 1, 8, and 13. For the midtones is -12, 31 and 9, and for the highlights -1, -2, and -5. So these are the settings for the color balance. Then I use levels to reduce the brightness of it. So add levels as clipping mask, and the values that I have for this are 8 for the shadows. For the midtones is 0.7, and the highlights it's unchanged. Then I wanted to create the same effect as here on the ground. I want to have this part of the dress darker, and for that I used layer styles and gradient overlay again. Set the angle like this because I want to have this part of the woman's body brighter than on the back, and you have to modify the gradient. So you have to make something like this. Delete. I want it black. Okay, so I'll click OK and move the gradient slightly and change the angle. And the blend mode that I used is multiply, and I reduced the opacity to about 45%. Maybe I'll have to change this. So as you can see now, this part of the dress is darker, and that's exactly what I want. But I still want to have the face nice and bright, so make sure you don't move the gradient too much. You don't want to have something like that. You just want to have the face bright enough. So something like that, and click OK. One thing that I see here and I don't like too much is this dark part here, and you can use the layer mask of the levels adjustment layer to make it brighter, because with the levels we made the whole image darker, so you can remove that effect using the layer mask. So I'll use a soft brush, and the opacity I have it at, and the flow to about 30%. I'll just brush around this part here because I don't want to have it too dark. So I'll remove some of that effect. Okay, I'm just worried about this part here, not on the bottom, because I want to have it darker here because it's close to the ground, and you can see this part is dark here. But I'm worried about this this zone here, and also here on the hand you can see it's very dark, and I don't want that. We will fix this even more with the dodging and burning, which we will do next. And another thing that I want to have is some rim lights here on this part of the body, and again you can use layer styles for that. And I used inner shadow. I'll deactivate use global light, adjust the angle, change the color to something like this, and click OK. Set the blend mode to color dodge, and you can see it's too strong. It's just burning the highlights, and I don't like that. So what you can do, instead of decreasing the opacity, well, you can also do that, but I prefer to use a darker color, and just increase the size a bit so that you have a smooth transition. And let me see how that looks. Okay, I think it looks better now. Change the angle slightly. well, something like that. It's not a very big change, but it helps. So you can see that the effect with and without the layer styles. So without and with the layer styles. We shifted the light a bit, and we made this part brighter and the back of the woman's body a bit darker, but I still don't like that inner shadow. It's too strong here on the face. Depending on how you have the image, how dark you made the ground, you may have to create some shadows, and I use the soft brush for that, and the black color, and use a low opacity, and just paint a few shadows here on the ground. Okay, something like that, and you can see that it looks a bit better, at least in my opinion. And once you get here, you can use the dodging and burning technique that I used in so many of my tutorials now. And the way I made this, I have an action for this. There's a video on the Photoshop for Beginners section called how to create an action, or my dodging and burning action, or something like that. But basically you create a new layer, go to edit, fill it with 50% gray, and then change the blend mode to overlay, and you get this gray layer which is invisible. If I turn it to normal, you can see it's filled with 50% gray, and when you set the blend mode to overlay, it becomes invisible. And you can use the dodging and burning on this layer. And I'll start with the dodge tool. Use a soft brush, set the exposure to about 15%, and let's see if it's too strong, and if it's too strong we will decrease the exposure. Make sure you have the range on midtones, and just start dodging the highlights. Basically what I want to do here is increase the highlights of these folds here. As you can see, these lines here, and also the shadows with the burn tool. And I also want to make this part just a bit brighter, and I will dodge also the tops of the rocks and parts of the sky. You can see these highlights here, these ones here, and these parts here as well. And with the burn tool I will burn parts of the sky, and also parts of the woman's dress, and also maybe the face. We'll see. So now I'm using the dodge tool, and I'm going over all these highlights, and when I'm done with this I will show you a before and after, so you can see that you can really create some nice effects with this. You can create shape, you can enhance the contrast, so you can make some pretty nice effects with this tool. Just need some practice. So as I said, I'm dodging the highlights here, especially the folds, to give them more shape and more definition. The exposures that I use are usually between 10 and 15%, depending on the areas where you dodge and burn, but it's better to use lower exposures and go several times over the same area and build up the effect, like I'm doing here. And by the way, I'm using the mouse. On the original artwork I used the tablet, but you can do it with the mouse without any kind of problem. Okay, enough with the dress. Let's go with some of these rocks here. Here I will increase the exposure a bit, because these rocks are a bit darker, and 15% exposure is too little for them to see the effect. So and maybe you won't see any change here, it's difficult to see, but wait until I deactivate this layer and you'll see the before and after, and you see that there's definitely a change. As I said, I want to have this part of the dress a bit brighter, and this one here is too bright. We will use the burn tool there. I'll decrease the exposure and go with the sky. Let's dodge the hair as well. Okay, I think that's enough. With the dodge tool, let's go with the burn tool now. Again, I'm using the same settings. The exposure is too strong. Just make sure you don't go over the same areas where you dodge, otherwise you're not doing anything. You're just undoing your own work. So go over the shadows with the burn tool and over the highlights with the dodge tool. And adjust your brush size to the areas that you're painting. And you can see I'm using a soft brush. Let's see if we can burn this part here. Also the hand, and I will have to select the woman's body by holding Control and clicking on the icon. You can select the edges of the layer, and I did that because I don't want to go with the burn tool over the sky here when I'm painting over the hand, so I'm restricting my work area with the selection. And I'll burn the face just a bit, and the neck, something like that. And I have to remember to use the dodge tool here on the hand. I want to have it brighter because it's too dark and I don't like it. Okay, that looks a bit better. And if you made a horrible mistake, like, I don't know, something like this, and you want to go back, you can use the brush tool and just set the color to 50%. Here on the B, set it to 50%, make sure you have no color, and set this to 50%, and make sure the opacity and the flow are to 100%. Just paint over the area and you go back to the original here, because you're painting with 50% gray. And then just use the dodge tool again, just reduce the exposure and start again. I still want to dodge some of these folds here, so I spent more time dodging and burning than making adjustments, and I like using this tool, the dodging and burning tools. It's just like painting with light. After you get a bit of practice, you will see how you can get really nice results with this tool. And if you want to have a stronger effect, you can duplicate this layer. If you press and hold the Alt key, click here and drag, and you create a duplicate of the layer. And I will group this, and I'll show you the before and after. So before and after. See too much dodging here because I duplicated that layer, but I can decrease the opacity of one of them to about 50%. So you can see the result. I think it looks better with the dodging and burning. And you're almost done. The next thing that I did is some general adjustment layers, and I added a color balance adjustment layer. This is not a clipping mask, so keep that in mind. And for the shadows I used -9, 9 and -1. For the midtones I used -10, -10 and 24. And for the highlights I used 12, 12 and -17. And you can see that the change is quite significant before and after. And then I added a gradient map, and I used this preset, and I set this to soft light and set the opacity to 20%. And then I wanted to have more shadows here on the corners, and I created a new layer. I got the elliptical marquee tool, set the foreground color to black, and I made a selection like this, a bit bigger, something like that. And then invert the selection. You can go to select, inverse, or press Shift Control I, and when you have this inverted selection, you can fill that selection with black if you press Alt and backspace. And now you can apply Gaussian blur to this. So go to blur, Gaussian blur, and add 250 pixels and click OK. And you can change the blend mode of this to soft light and decrease the opacity to about 75 or 80%. Let's leave it on 75%. And this is how I made this manipulation. One thing you can do if you want to add another interesting effect is on the city layer, which is that background. You can turn this into a smart object, or if you don't, if you have an older version of Photoshop that don't allow you to make smart objects, just duplicate that layer and go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and add 3 pixels of blur, or 5, but 5 is too much for me, so I used 3 pixels only. And also for the ground you can do that. and turn this into a smart object, and go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and again add 3 pixels of blur. But in this case, it's better if you use smart objects. If you don't have the option to use smart objects, it's better not to add Gaussian blur on this, because you have to create masks, and with this smart objects, when you add a filter, it becomes a smart filter, so you don't have to create 2 layers and use layer masks. So if you cannot create smart objects, you can leave the background as it is. But in this case, I have the option to use smart objects, so I have a smart filter with a layer mask, and I can use that layer mask to get rid of some of the blur, but I will decrease the opacity of the brush to 50% and the flow as well, and just remove some of that out of focus effect, because I only want to have that effect here on the edges. So I'll leave the ground that's close to the woman's feet nice and sharp, and fade the effect towards the edges of this strip of land here. This is just an effect that I added, but well, you can do whatever you want. That way you have the background out of focus, and you have that interesting background there, but I don't know, just up to you. So that's all for today. I hope you like the result. If you have any questions, just post a comment. Feel free to share this tutorial, and you can upload your results on my Flickr page or on my DeviantArt group, which I will create soon. And the links to Flickr and my YouTube page are on the. If you're watching this from the website, there's a menu that says there's a subscribe menu right here, and I'll add DeviantArt here as well, so you can go to Facebook, Twitter, or Flickr from here and post your results there. So until next time, I'm Andrei. Thank you for watching, and see you on the next tutorial.